Happy January 19th, Bookworms! Today we celebrate the 208th birthday of the great Edgar Allan Poe, the man who is not only famous for very dark and macabre stories, but actually the author who invented the detective genre. How many authors can you name that actually invented an entire genre? And what better way to honor Edgar Allan Poe's birthday other than just to name my 10 favorite detective books? And before we begin, of course, I want to know, do you guys like detective books? And if so, what is the one book that kept you up at night because you just had to know who the killer is? And now in no particular order, as always, let's begin. Okay guys, if you've been watching my channel for a while, you know who's gonna come first. You know, ladies first, and this lady is the queen of crime. She's probably my favorite author, well, if not one of my most favorite authors, Dame Agatha Christie, and she's wonderful. And the first two books that I'm gonna mention are by her because I couldn't choose one, and they both are equally fantastic in my opinion. And let's begin with Murder on the Orient Express. This is probably one of her most famous books. It sets in the 1930s on the Orient Express train that is traveling with a lot of very different passengers, from a Russian princess and her German maid to a Swedish missionary and an Italian car salesman. This guest list is so eclectic, so when one of the passengers is murdered, the Belgian detective Hercule Poirot has to ask himself, did one of the other guests actually knew him, and how? This is such a fantastic, thrilling book with such a great twist that I personally think still holds today, and it's so suspenseful. And just think about how this entire book takes place in one train, few rooms in it, and it's amazing. And it had a wonderful movie adaptation from 1974, but read the book first. The next book is And Then There Were None, also by Agatha Christie, and I mentioned this book on my Halloween video from last year, 2015, because this book may be a detective thriller, but it's also, in my opinion, a horror story. And Then There Were None is about 10 strangers who find themselves stuck on a mansion on the very small island, and one by one they're being murdered according to lines on a nursery rhyme. And if either this synopsis or the one previous to it, Murder on the Orient Express, sound a bit familiar, it's because so many other books and movies and other things are based on her ideas. This one is a bit more horror style. For example, the horror movie Identity is definitely based on this one, even though it goes to a completely different direction. But nonetheless, Agatha Christie definitely paved the way to a lot of other horror books. Let's move on to something a little more modern. The next one actually managed to surprise me because I honestly thought that the days of classic detective books are over, and this book is definitely modern. It has a hacker as one of the main protagonists, but nonetheless, The Girl with a Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson definitely managed to surprise me. It's such a fantastic detective thriller. It's about an investigating journalist and his hacker sidekick, who is actually the girl with a dragon tattoo, and they're trying to find out what happened to a girl that disappeared and was probably murdered 40 years ago. Now this book has two very cool things going on for it. The first one is the whole idea of investigating a mystery that occurred so long ago. It's very interesting. But the second one is the whole confinement idea. Like the first two books that I mentioned here, most of the story takes place on one small island, circles around one family. It has definitely the Agatha Christie whodunit kind of theme in the confined space around a few people that you know one of them is the killer, and it's great. I am, however, kind of disappointed from the American translation of the title. In the original Swedish, it was translated to Men Who Hate Women. And this book has definitely a lot of sexual abuse and rape in it. It's very brutal, so I think you should know what you're getting into. But nonetheless, unless you're very, very sensitive about these things, this book is absolutely brilliant. We're moving on, but staying on the same area. The next book was also a surprise. This is The Truth About the Harry Kacker Affair by Joel Dicker. This is also a book that I mentioned in videos before. I tend to do it. I tend to repeat, but you know, these are the books that I love. And it just occurred to me that there are a few similar things between this one and the previous entry. Think about it. This book, The Truth About the Harry Kacker Affair, is about an author who is doing a personal favor to a friend, try to acquit him of the charge of murder by finding the real killer of a girl that disappeared 30 years ago. Sound a little familiar, doesn't it? But this cannot be anything further than the girl with the dragon tattoo. This is something completely different. And this book, as you can see, is not a very small book, but I've read it in 2 days. Most people read it so fast because it's so suspenseful. It's such a page turner. It's full of twists and it's absolutely fantastic. And once again, it takes place in this small town, one of those small towns that you actually, you know, you grow up and die in. You know, the same people that were there 30 years ago are still there, only older, and it's such a recommended book. Book number 5 is Child 44 by Tom Rob Smith, a book that is loosely based on actual true events. It sets in the Soviet Union in the 1940s. And like I said, it's loosely based on true events of a serial killer. And what happened is that basically the Soviet government shoved into people's throats and brainwashed them that the communist society is a perfect society and therefore has no crimes. So when a bunch of kids are dying, it's contributed to unfortunate accidents. So when a police officer called Leo Demidov claimed that there might be a serial killer, he actually goes against the government by claiming that there is actually crime in the perfect communist society, and he and his wife Raisa have to flee in order to escape from the same government that he used to be a very proud part of. So on one hand they have to flee from the police, but on the other hand they also want to find the murderer in order to, you know, to save future kids and to bring this murderer to justice. And I did a review on this book. Granted, it was not edited good. I am considering actually either re-editing it or doing it entirely from the start, doing a complete new video. But like I said on my review, the actual creepy part here was not necessarily the murders, who were indeed really creepy, but also the entire atmosphere of this time period, this great paranoia that everyone felt, and how scary it was just to live in this society. And kudos for Tom Rob Smith, who is actually English, who managed to portray this time period so well. Book number 6 is definitely one of the more unique books on this list, and I actually don't have it in English, I only have it in Hebrew, which is quite ironic. This is the Yiddish Policemens Union by Michael Chabon, and if you know Michael Chabon, you know that he usually writes about Jewish Americans or just generally Jewish people. That's why I find it a bit ironic that I have it in Hebrew. And this is a pretty cool alternate history book. It sets in a world where World War II ended a bit differently. And to cut a long story short, the remaining Jews of the world live in a small Alaskan town, which is divided according to different Jewish religious streams. And when the son of one of the rabbis goes missing, it's up to the protagonist, the private detective Meir Lantzman, to try and find him. It's a pretty cool story. As a very, very non-religious Jew, an atheist Jew, if such thing exists, I found it very, very interesting. I have very little knowledge about the different Jewish streams, even though I grew up in Israel, and I just find it so cool, the whole Jewish film noir alternate history detective book that Michael Chabon creates here. And it not only has a great tribute to film noir books in the character of Meir Lantzman, who is, you know, he's a film noir detective. He's bitter, he has demons in his past, he drinks, he smokes, and you know the story. So it's not only that, but you can't compete with Michael Chabon's writing. He just writes so wonderful. The words that he chooses are fantastic, and just go ahead and read this one. Book number 7 is just one of those books that I seem to bring up a lot of times. I swear this is not on purpose, but every other list I just mention it because it fits there and it's a great book, and it's The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris. I mentioned it, I think, in at least 2 other lists, but it really fits here. This is a very famous detective book with a very famous movie adaptation about a young FBI trainee called Clarice Starling, who is caught up in an attempt to catch the serial killer Buffalo Bill, and the only way to do it seemed to be with the help of Dr. Hannibal Lecter, who is not only a brilliant psychiatrist, but also a very dangerous mental patient. This is a great book. This is kind of like a modern classic, and you've probably heard of it before. I don't think any further introduction is needed, but I just want to say that besides being a really great detective book, it also features one of my favorite strong female characters. This is, of course, Clarice Starling, who is not only a kick-ass FBI agent in a world full of men. She's one of the only female characters there, the others being the murder victims. But also what I liked is the fact that she succeeds because of traits that are very feminine, like the ability to observe little details or to be compassionate and actually listen. We're down to book number 8, and I actually don't have it. I have the sequel, so I'll just show you the sequel. And the book that I'm talking about is The Yard by Alex Gratian, and this is the first book in the Murder Squad series, and this is the sequel. I did a review on this one. Spoiler alert, is not as good as the first one, but you're more than welcome to see my review. I'll link it down below. All the books in the Murder Squad series are about a very dark time to write about. I think that after the Dark Ages, this is probably the darkest time to write about. One of my favorite times to read about, Victorian London. The Yard sets in 1889, which, if you know your history, you know that is 1 year after Jack the Ripper was active. And the police force encounters a new threat, what seemed to be like a new serial killer. And one of the things that I love about this book is how realistically, in my opinion, it shows the Victorian period. First of all, it shows how devastating Jack the Ripper was to society, how people lost confidence in the police force. This was the first time something like this happened, such a prolific serial killer that was actually never caught. And it talks about the everyday lives of people. I think that a lot of people kind of romanticizing about the Victorian times, and I know that I already mentioned it, I don't remember when, but it wasn't a very nice time to live in. The sanitation conditions were absolutely terrible, which entails not only very bad smells all around, but also disease. Any person who acted a bit strange would be sent to the asylum, and people weren't really treated nicely there. And if you were a woman, you were hysterical. Either that or... No, you were just hysterical. Not a very nice time to live in, but definitely a very cool time to read about. Okay, we're down to the last 2 books, and before I mention them, I just want to say that the previous 8 books were obvious choices to me. But then I reached the last 2 spots and I realized, I don't really have a lot of ideas because all the obvious choices are already mentioned. And then there were some books that were okay, but were they worthy to be in the top 10 detective book list? So the next 2 books are going to be 2 books that actually surprised me simply by being suspenseful. Are they the best detective books ever written? Definitely no. And once again, they surprised me by being good, so I deemed them worthy to be here on this list. So here they are. Book number 9 is a book that I actually don't have on me to show you, but I did a review on it, and it's Good Night Nobody by Jennifer Weiner. And if you're surprised by the fact that Jennifer Weiner, mostly known for her chick lit, is here, you're not alone. But nonetheless, she wrote this suburban thriller with all the wits and cynicism that she's most famous for, and this book is like the first season of Desperate Housewives. It's about the perfect suburban life that the moment you start scratching the surface, you realize it's not so perfect after all, And it's a perfect combination between this kind of non-shallow, not stupid chick lit with a great detective book and a bit of a message about our lives. And last but not least is actually No Time for Goodbye by Linwood Berkeley. I was really surprised about this book. I read it because it was there and I had some free time. I thought, okay, another Harlan Coben-ish style of book, but this one was actually thrilling and suspenseful. It's about a woman who, as a child, her family simply disappears without a trace. Years later, when she's a grown-up, her husband thinks that one of her family members might still be alive and tries to investigate. And I define Linwood Berkeley as like Harlan Coben, but good. I'm sorry, I really dislike Harlan Coben's books, but Linwood Berkeley writes about similar themes. They usually both write about neighborhoods and families and homes, but Linwood Berkeley actually managed to bring a suspenseful, thrilling narrative into a genre that is so chewed up, and that's why he's here. And I forgot to mention, but I think an honorable mention should be Paranoia by Joseph Finder, which I think similar things about. So guys, that was my list. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please click like to show it. You're more than welcome to also subscribe to my channel or join me in other social media. The links are down below. So thank you very much for watching this video, and until next time, goodbye, because we actually have time for it.